The moment I stepped into the kitchen of the retirement home, feeling the warmth of the ovens and hearing the sizzle of pans, I found an unexpected refuge from the coldness at home. Gary, with his years on me and a possessiveness that tightened like a vice, had been making life unbearable. But here, in this whirlwind of culinary chaos, I found camaraderie with David. He was more than a mentor. He was a fellow soul navigating the rough seas of marriage and family life. Our conversations, tucked between the slicing of vegetables and the plating of meals, became the lifeline I hadn't known I needed. But peace, it seems, was a luxury. Gary's accusations started like a storm brewing on the horizon, distant at first, then all at once overwhelming. "I know you're seeing him," he'd hiss, voice laced with venom, eyes narrow with a jealousy so thick it suffocated. David was nothing but a friend, a colleague, but to Gary he was the thief of affection he no longer claimed. My denials fell on deaf ears, and our home turned into a battlefield. Every accusation a grenade that blasted away bits of trust and love. In a bid to quell the storm, to prove our innocence, I suggested something simple, naive, perhaps, an introduction via social media. "Let's show them how ridiculous this all is," I said to David over the phone, the plan sounding foolproof in my head. David agreed, his voice weary but hopeful. If our spouses saw how mundane, how professional our relationship was, perhaps the green-eyed monster would retreat, leaving us to salvage what was left of our marriages. Little did I know, this act of defense would set the stage for a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. Never in a million years did I think clicking send on that friend request would detonate our lives. But there it was, a digital match that lit a fuse, hidden under the guise of strengthening ties. Gary and Lee, David's then wife, took that opening like a secret handshake into a world we never wanted to enter. It was supposed to be innocent, a way to smudge out the ridiculous accusations both our spouses hurled at us. Little did I know, it was the beginning of an elaborate dance of deception. "Let's just show them there's nothing to worry about," I had suggested to David, thinking a transparent connection between our spouses would quell the storm. Gary's obsession had reached boiling point, and this seemed like the only way out. "Absolutely," David agreed, "transparency is key. If only we knew." The signs were subtle at first. Whispered phone calls, late nights at the office, and sudden weekend business trips. My gut twisted every time Gary mumbled another excuse. It was as if the man I married had morphed into a stranger, slinking around our home with a guilt I couldn't quite catch. Meanwhile, David and I, thrown apart by new job opportunities, drifted into silence. Life, with its uncanny ability to build walls between old friends, did just that. My marriage was crumbling, yet I was marooned on an island of solitude, unaware that David was navigating his own wreck. Then, like a cruel twist of fate, Gary's health plummeted. Terminal illness has a way of stripping down life to its bare bones, revealing the raw truths we'd rather not see. "Mourn me for 15 minutes, he'd said, a smirk playing on his lips, but stay away from David. That comment haunted me, a puzzle piece that refused to fit until it was too late. The irony was thick enough to cut. Here I was, accused of turning my back on my marriage, while Gary had been orchestrating his own betrayal. And David, the supposed other man, was just as much in the dark as I was. Our spouses, united in deceit, had left us grappling with a reality that was about to come crashing down. Life has a funny way of throwing you back into the orbit of people who matter, just when you think you're drifting alone in space. That's exactly what happened with David and me, in the last place I'd have ever expected. The cluttered aisles of a local game store. I was there, trying to find some semblance of normalcy for my kid, when I heard a voice that yanked me back years. "Long time no see," David said, his smile warm but his eyes carrying stories I hadn't read. As we caught up, standing amidst shelves of video games and the echoes of digital battles, the weight of the years apart seemed to dissolve. David looked different, the kind of change that goes beyond the physical, etched deep by pain and loss. He shared his story with a bravery I couldn't help but admire, about how Lee's neglect had cost him not just his marriage but his leg. My heart ached for him, this man who had once been accused alongside me, now bearing scars from a battle he never chose to fight. The turn our lives had taken felt like something out of a movie, but there we were, finding solace in shared suffering. David's honesty brought us closer, his vulnerability breaking down walls I didn't even realize I had built. It was in those moments of shared stories and understood silences that our old friendship began to blossom into something more. We started seeing each other, tentatively at first, as if both scared to admit how right it felt. Then came Valentine's Day, a lunch date neither of us realized was on such a charged day until we were surrounded by couples lost in each other's eyes. It might have been the mood, the setting, or maybe just the right time, but that lunch marked the beginning of us, two people scarred by betrayal, finding a new path together. Our relationship wasn't just a rebellion against the past. It was our way of reclaiming our stories, of stitching together new memories from the tatters left by those we had trusted most. With David, I found not just a partner, but a fellow survivor, someone who understood the depths of pain and the heights of healing. Our journey wasn't easy, but then again, the most meaningful stories rarely are. Just when you think you've turned a new leaf, the past has a way of clawing its way back. I learned this the hard way, rummaging through old boxes that still smelled like the life Gary and I shared. It was supposed to be a cleansing ritual, a way to finally let go of him and all the hurt. Instead, I found his old phone, a relic I thought was lost, buried under layers of forgotten memories. Curiosity, that old traitor, nudged me to charge it up. And there it was, the Pandora's box of texts, photos, and voicemails that blew the lid off the lie I'd been living. Gary and Lee's affair wasn't just a rumor, it was a well-documented reality. I sat there, phone in hand, heart hammering against my chest, torn between two agonizing choices. Telling David could shatter the fragile peace he'd built around his heart. But keeping the secret felt like a betrayal of its own, a shadow that could loom over us, threatening the trust we'd fought so hard to establish. The weight of the decision pressed down on me, a test of our relationship's resilience. David, we need to talk. I found myself saying later, my voice barely a whisper, trembling with the weight of the truths I was about to unload. His gaze, steady and understanding, encouraged me to continue. As the story spilled out, the color drained from his face, replaced by a storm of emotions that flickered too fast for me to read. The silence that followed was deafening, a chasm that threatened to swallow us whole. David's response was measured, a testament to the strength I'd always admired in him. I wish I could say I'm surprised, he finally said, his voice laced with a bitterness that wasn't directed at me. But thank you for telling me we can't let their choices define us. The conversation that followed was a roller coaster, a tumultuous journey through anger, sadness, and eventually, a kind of acceptance. We were two people, bonded not just by love, but by the shared scars of our pasts, deciding to face the future together, no matter how uncertain it looked. The revelation of Gary and Lee's affair was a test, one that we could only pass by holding on to each other, choosing transparency over secrecy, and healing over hurt. The bombshell I dropped about Gary and Lee's affair might have been out in the open, but the fallout was a slow burn, eating away at the edges of David and me. It was like watching a crack creep its way through ice, silent but deadly. David, who'd always been my rock, suddenly seemed adrift, caught in a storm of his own making. His trust, that once unshakable foundation, now quivered under the weight of betrayal's long shadow. How do we move past this? He'd ask, his voice a mix of anger and desperation, a mirror to the turmoil churning inside me. The answer came not from running away, but from facing our demons head-on. We need to talk to Lee, I declared one evening, my resolve steeling. We need closure. David's nod, though hesitant, signaled our unspoken pact to weather this storm together. Arranging the confrontation was easy, facing it was anything but. Lee's house stood as a monument to the life she and David once shared, a life now as shattered as the trust between us. The door swung open, and there she was, the other half of our shared agony, her eyes wary yet defiant. The conversation ignited quickly, a volatile mix of accusation and defense. You had no right. David's voice boomed, every word a thunderclap of hurt and accusation. Lee's retorts were sharp, slicing through the tense air with claims of loneliness and abandonment. And you were perfect? She shot back, her words laced with venom. I watched, a silent arbiter, as the past and present collided, spilling secrets and pains long buried. It was a dance as old as time, love entangled with betrayal, each word a step closer to the brink. The heated exchange laid bare the raw, ugly wounds we each harbored, the kind that festered in the dark. Yet, amidst the chaos, a strange sense of clarity emerged. This confrontation, as painful as it was, served as a crucible, burning away the illusions we'd clung to. What was left was the stark truth of our situation, damaged, yes, but not beyond repair. It was a beginning, albeit a tumultuous one, to the healing we so desperately sought. In an instant, our quest for closure spiraled into chaos, turning a confrontation into a catastrophe we never saw coming. What began as a heated exchange with Lee abruptly shifted into a physical struggle, a frenzied attempt to quell the rising storm. But fate, cruel and unforgiving, had other plans. A misplaced step, a stumble, details blurred into a horrific tableau, culminating in Lee's fall. The sound of the impact was sickening, a final note in the symphony of our shared tragedy. There, on the cold floor, lay the stark, irreversible outcome of our actions. Lee motionless, her life a candle snuffed out in the gust of our tempest. The aftermath was a blur of sirens, flashing lights, and the cold, impersonal questions of those tasked with piecing together the events. David and I, united in shock and despair, found ourselves navigating a nightmare of legal entanglements and moral reckonings. I never wanted this. I found myself whispering, over and over, a mantra against the tide of guilt that threatened to drown us. Our relationship, once a beacon of hope amid the ruins of our pasts, now bore the heavy chains of regret. The love that had blossomed in the aftermath of betrayal was tested in the crucible of guilt and recrimination. How do we get past this? David asked one night, the shadows of our cell-like room painting his face with grief. The question hummed between us, heavy and unanswered. The trial was a spectacle, a public dissection of our lives and choices. Prosecutors painted us as villains, our pasts fodder for a narrative that cast a long shadow over the truth. Our communities, once havens of support and camaraderie, turned their backs, leaving us isolated in a desert of judgment and scorn. Every headline, every whisper of our names, was a reminder of the tragedy we'd unwittingly authored. The court of public opinion had reached its verdict long before the judge had spoken. Guilty, not just of the accident, but of every misstep that had led us here. Our reputations, painstakingly built, were now irrevocably tarnished. The stain of Lee's death a mark we could never erase. In the end, the legal judgment was almost secondary to the sentence we'd already imposed on ourselves. The prison of guilt was one from which there was no parole, its bars forged from the memories of a night that had changed everything. David and I, once survivors of betrayal, now found ourselves shipwrecked on the shoals of a tragedy of our own making. Our love story, a cautionary tale whispered in the shadows of our once welcoming communities. Caught in the maelstrom of public condemnation and legal battles, desperation clutched at our hearts with icy fingers. The world we knew had crumbled, leaving us grappling in the ruins for any semblance of the life we once cherished. It was in this dark hour, with our backs against the wall, that David and I concocted a plan born out of despair. If we could just sway the evidence, tilt the scales in favor. David murmured one night, his voice a mixture of hope and desolation. It was a dangerous game we were considering, a dance with deceit in a bid to reclaim fragments of our former lives. The plan was simple yet fraught with risk. We would seek out key witnesses, those whose testimonies could damn us further or lend us a lifeline. It was a gamble, a play for redemption on a board set by fate. Yet, in our blinded state, the line between right and wrong had blurred, the ends justifying the means in our warped view. The turning point came in a shadowed alleyway, a clandestine meeting with a witness who held the power to alter our destiny. The air was thick with tension. Each word exchanged a loaded die cast in the game of chance. But fate, ever fickle, turned against us. The meeting erupted into chaos, a scuffle in the dark that ended with a scream, my own. Pain seared through me, a burning lance that heralded the shattering of more than just bone. In that instant, the cost of our gambit was laid bare, the loss of my leg a brutal testament to the depth of our fall. The aftermath was a blur of pain and recriminations, the hospital room a stark cell that mirrored the prison we had built around ourselves. David's face, once a beacon of strength and comfort, now seemed a mask of the stranger, guilt and sorrow etching deep lines around his eyes. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice a ghost of the man I once knew. But apologies were band-aids on a gushing wound. Our actions had set us on a path from which there was no return. Our relationship, once a bastion against the world's slings and arrows, began to crumble under the weight of our choices. The quest for vengeance had consumed us, leaving behind a chasm filled with the debris of trust and love. Conversations turned into confrontations, our shared space a battleground scarred by regrets and what-ifs. In the cold light of day, the realization dawned on us that the battle we were fighting was not against the world, but against the darkness within ourselves. Our desperate bid for revenge had not only failed but had cost us dearly, both in flesh and spirit. The price of our folly was etched in the lines of our story, a cautionary tale of love besieged by the specters of guilt and betrayal. In a cruel twist of irony, the very plan we'd pinned our hopes on became our undoing. The legal system, with its cold, unyielding grasp, caught up with us, unraveling the desperate threads we'd woven in a bid to save ourselves. The verdict was a hammer blow, each word a nail in the coffin of our future. Imprisonment for David, house arrest for me, my disability the only thing sparing me from the cold bars of a cell. The gavel's fall echoed not just in the courtroom, but through the very core of our being, sealing our fate with the finality of a tomb. Lying in my hospital bed, a prison of another kind, I had nothing but time to reflect on the dizzying descent that had led us here. The room, sterile and impersonal, was a far cry from the life I once knew. It was here, amidst the beeping of machines and the muted steps of nurses, that the full weight of our actions settled on my shoulders. The realization was a bitter pill, each thought a sharp jab at the conscience I tried so hard to silence. We had been caught in a web of our own making, ensnared by choices that spiraled beyond our control, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. The loneliness was suffocating, a constant companion that reminded me of the cost of our folly. David, the man who had stood by me through the darkest of times, was now beyond my reach, locked away because of decisions we made together. The irony was a cold comfort, a reminder of how quickly the world you build can crumble under the weight of ill-fated choices. In the aftermath, the decision to leave the city was as much about escape as it was about survival. My heart, heavy with the scars of betrayal, guilt, and loss, yearned for a clean slate, a chance to rebuild from the ashes of a life consumed by vengeance. The city, with its labyrinthine streets and whispered rumors, held too many ghosts, too many memories of what had been and what could never be again. As I crossed the threshold of what had once been our home for the last time, a sense of finality washed over me. The suitcase in my hand was light, but the burden on my soul was anything but. The decision to leave was a vow to myself, a promise to seek redemption not in the eyes of others, but within the quiet recesses of my own heart. The journey ahead was uncertain, a path unmarked and shrouded in the mists of tomorrow. Yet, as I stepped into the embrace of the unknown, a fragile hope took root. It was time to let go of the past, to shed the cloak of lies, betrayal, and revenge that had defined my existence. The road to healing was long and fraught with challenges, but I was ready to face them, armed with the harsh lessons etched into my being. As the city receded into the distance, a chapter closed behind me, not with the bitterness of regret, but with the quiet resolve of acceptance. I was forever changed, scarred by the journey, yet buoyed by the promise of a new beginning. The legacy of our choices would always be a part of me, a reminder of the price of love and the cost of vengeance. But in the end, it was the journey itself that would define me, not the mist. I, 34 male, met my wife, 33 female, 10 years ago at a small art gallery in the city. My best friend, let's call him Oliver, was an artist and he was showing a piece there. My wife was there with one of her friends and I approached her as soon as I saw her. I thought she was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen and I had to be with her. My wife's friend, let's call her Mia, actually ended up going home with Oliver that night. Somehow Oliver and I ended up marrying best friends. We thought it was funny, but it was really perfect for all four of us. We went on double dates together all the time. We took trips together and we even planned vacations together. The four of us were practically inseparable. My wife was a librarian, so she didn't have much opportunity to travel for work. However, I worked in advertising and I traveled often to film commercials. We were used to my schedule for the most part. Oliver and Mia both worked from home on a business that I ran together online. So when I was gone, I knew that my wife spent a lot of time with Oliver and Mia. I didn't mind it at all. I was glad that she had somebody there to keep her company. During one of the work trips that I had planned, my computer had an issue with the screen, so I sent it to Geek Squad to have it repaired. While I was gone, I took my wife's computer since she rarely used it at home anyway. I got to my hotel room when my plane landed and went to use the computer to check some emails and get some work done. You can always tell when somebody clears a history on something. My wife didn't use the computer a lot, but I knew that she used it. There should have been histories of Christmas gifts she was planning on buying, bookstores, and her personal email accounts. However, the history was completely blank. I was a little curious about why she cleared the history before giving me the computer. Granted, it was her personal computer and she probably looked things up that she didn't want me to know about. If the shoe were on the other foot, I would have cleared my history before giving my computer to my wife. I didn't give it too much thought after that because I didn't think that my wife would do anything sketchy. However, moments later, I accidentally logged into her email using the saved information that she had instead of using my own. It sounds convenient, but it genuinely was an accident. I was so used to using my credentials that way that I just pressed OK without giving it a second thought. I went to log out of it right away when I realized, but then I saw an email exchange between my wife and Oliver. The message in the inbox was the most recent one out of a 280 email chain. I knew that they were friends. All four of us were. I had no idea that they were having private conversations with each other. Struck me as very odd. I clicked on it to see what it was and I was completely broken by what I found. They were having an affair with each other. They were sending each other explicit videos and images through email and planning the times when they would be able to get together. I didn't read through all the messages, but I did look at some of the first ones that they sent to try and figure out when it started. The affair had been going on for 2 years. Anytime I was away from home, Oliver and my wife took that opportunity to be together. They slept together even when I wasn't on a working trip. There were times when my wife would sneak Oliver into the library after it was closed and have sex with him when nobody else was in the building. Early on, there were some emails about possibly bringing me and Mia in on the situation and swinging. It was Oliver who suggested it, but my wife immediately told him that I wouldn't be okay with it. She was right to think that. Oliver thought that Mia might have been convincible, stating that he thought she would be gullible enough to just do what he wanted. I thought that was a horrible thing to say. I ended up converting all of those emails into a PDF and keeping that for myself. I marked the most recent message as unread and logged out to make it seem like I had no idea what was happening. I was going to be away for 3 days working and I had to focus on what I was doing or I could risk losing my job. It was absolute torture trying to pretend like nothing was happening when it felt like my entire world was shattering. I had the PDF and I needed to figure out the best way to utilize it. My wife and best friend had both betrayed me and I wanted to get back at them and make them regret ever crossing me. I mulled over what I could do when I returned and it finally hit me. It was the middle of summer and it wasn't anything out of the ordinary to invite Oliver and Mia over for a barbecue and some drinks. I suggested it for the weekend when I got back and my wife was all for it. They showed up on that Saturday and everything was normal. While we were eating, I brought up to everyone the possibility that we trade partners for the night. It was a joke. I had no intention of doing that, but I just wanted to see their reactions. Mia was appalled by what I suggested, but noticeably my wife and Oliver weren't that shocked. Oliver's lack of reaction actually upset Mia quite a bit. My wife pulled me aside and asked me about why I suggested that, but I just went back to the table and I told Oliver that it was his idea after all. I quoted what he said in the email and mentioned that he thought that Mia would be gullible and would go for it. She was very confused, so I handed her a couple of pages of the email highlights that I printed out. She read over them, and from the context she figured out what was happening very quickly. She immediately started screaming at my wife and Oliver about what they did. She was hysterical and upset about everything, and I didn't blame her. I felt the same way when I first found out. Oliver tried to punch me in the face. He accused me of ruining his life. I didn't fight him as much as I wanted to take my anger out on him. I knew that it would only lead to more drama. My wife tried to explain what was happening to me, but nothing she said helped her. Basically, she said that she and Oliver had always been attracted to each other, and after a while they couldn't take it anymore. They ended up sleeping together. She told me that she didn't think monogamy was for her either, which would have been nice to know before I was married to her for 6 years. Mia and I both ended up divorcing them and pretty much taking everything from them in the divorce. They said that they were attracted to each other, but after everything happened, they didn't even try to be together. Oliver desperately tried to get back with Mia because he said that it was a mistake and she almost gave in to be with him. I was able to talk her out of it. I sent the information about my wife sleeping with Oliver in the library to her boss, and she was fired. Now she lives in a studio apartment in the city. She's reached out to me several times apologizing and suggesting that we give it another try. I think she's realized just how good she had it with me and regrets her choices now. I'm in a good place now after all of this, and I don't want to look back at any of it. I'm finally ready to put myself back out there and move on from it completely. I can't even imagine finding out that the two people you should have trusted most in the world have betrayed you while you're away from them and have to pretend like nothing happened. It must have been unbearable for you to go through that. It definitely sounds like Oliver wasn't a good guy by any means. Saying that he could manipulate his wife into doing something even if she didn't want to do it is very creepy. It's a really good thing that you convinced her not to get back together with him when he tried. She likely would have been very unhappy with him after everything anyway. I always think using the excuse of not wanting to be in a monogamous relationship after cheating is ridiculous. If you feel that you might be polyamorous, then you need to discuss that with your partner before you cheat on them. If it comes down to it, you might not be compatible, and that's okay. Cheating is never an option. It sounds like she was just using that as an excuse to make it seem like she was more sympathetic. Anyways, let's now get into our second story for my 28 male, Fianca copyright 26 female, and I met at a bookstore about 3 years ago. She was working there at the time, and I was going to pick up some new books. She was stocking the shelves, and I saw her and thought she was cute. I asked her for some help looking for a particular book, and we walked off together. We started talking, and I asked her for her number, and things took off from there. I proposed to her about 2 years into the relationship. I knew from the moment that we met that she was something special. I knew I wanted to be with her, and I saw a future with her. Our relationship was great from the start, except for a few issues that we had to work through based on her past relationship. Her ex-boyfriend, who we'll call Ben, was her first serious relationship. They were together for 7 years, and throughout the entirety of it, he was cheating on her and treating her like garbage. She was single for about a year before we met. During that time, she said she did a lot of self-discovery and healed from the relationship, though it didn't always seem like that to me. I never gave her any reason to suspect that I was cheating on her, and I treated her like a queen. The only issue that ever came up was when she started to feel insecure about herself. The relationship she had with Ben put a toll on her, and there were times when she thought that she wasn't good enough to be with someone like me. Ben was a sleaze. He couldn't hold down a job. He was sleeping with anybody that would pay him any attention, and he berated her for the smallest things. I didn't do any of that. I had a great job. She was the only woman for me, and I made sure she knew how wonderful I thought she was. I would treat her with respect, and she wasn't used to it. I knew she had a lot of trauma from that relationship, and I did everything in my power to help her get through it. But I could only do so much. It was on her to take care of her trauma and recover from it. As much as I loved her, it didn't seem like she was willing to take those steps. I hate even saying it because it sounds so insensitive, but it's the truth. I suggested that she go to therapy or see a counselor, but she would tell me that she couldn't afford it. I even offered to pay for it, and she didn't want to do that. All I could do was hope the situation would get better over time. I worked a regular 9 to 5 job in the office and she was working at the bookstore. Her hours were less regular than mine. Some days she would go in around 10 a.m. and some days she would go in around 2 p.m. I was always at work when she was leaving, regardless of the time, but I always picked her up afterward because she didn't have a car. Because she took public transportation, we shared our locations on our iPhones, so I could always make sure she was safe. It's not something I normally would have done in a relationship, but she had several run-ins with creepy passengers on buses and it made her nervous. I also like having that peace of mind. Around the holidays with Black Friday coming up, she was picking up a lot of extra hours preparing for Black Friday sales. Part of that included optional late-night hours that allowed her to prepare new displays and unpack the large quantities of inventory the store received before the sales. When she did that, I didn't see her for dinner or anything like that. I offered to pick her up when she was off her shifts, but she told me that she didn't want to disturb me, so she just planned on taking Uber. I didn't want her to get into some strange man's car in the middle of the night and have something happen, so I stayed up for her regardless. I told her that was the plan, but she insisted on me not picking her up because she didn't want to bother me. The first night that she was gone, I checked her location around 11 o'clock when she was supposed to be clocking out and I saw that she was at the bookstore. I could see the location updating every few minutes when I checked it to show was in a car on her way home. Everything looked good, so I was less worried. One week, she told me that she was only scheduled to work late 3 days. But on Thursday, she told me that she would be working late again. I wasn't immediately suspicious about that because it seemed like a normal enough thing. I figured maybe another coworker called out or decided they didn't want the extra hours after all. That night, I did what I always did when she worked late. I was up and around the time she was supposed to be coming home. I looked at her location. Only that time she wasn't at work. She was at Ben's house. Right away, I was wondering what she was doing there. Surely, if she had to go over to his house for anything, she would have told me about it. It feels silly to admit it, but I didn't even think that an affair was possible. It never would have crossed my mind that she would be cheating on me with him. I waited for the location to change for about half an hour and it didn't. It wasn't moving at all. I felt weird looking at her location without her knowing. So I waited about 10 more minutes until she would normally be home and I called her. She didn't answer. After that, I started to worry. She never ignored my calls or messages. I knew that Ben didn't have her best interests in mind whatsoever. From what she described, he was never violent with her, but he didn't want her to leave him. I ran through countless different scenarios in my head about what could have been happening. None of them involved her cheating on me. After the location had it moved and she didn't answer my calls, I decided I was going to go see for myself what was happening. I drove over to the house and saw a car in the driveway, so I assumed that Ben was still there. When I checked my fiancée's location, she was still inside the house. I approached the front door, but before I could get there, I heard music coming from the other side. It was the type of music you would have on a sex playlist. It was then that I realized nothing nefarious was happening, and she could have willingly gone there to have an affair. I was frozen for a moment. I didn't know exactly what to do. I had a pretty good idea about what was happening in the house, but I figured if I knocked they could play it off as something that it wasn't. I ended up going back to my house and waiting there. My fiancée didn't come home for about another 45 minutes after I got back. I just rolled over and pretended to sleep while she got ready for bed. I asked her about work the following morning and she told me that it was fine. She even made up a story about some drama that happened. She was lying to my face. She also told me that the late night hours were going to be extended for a couple more weeks. I figured that she was lying about that too. She was preemptively covering for the time she was going to be spending with her ex. That same night, she ended up going back over to her ex's house again. I knew it was happening and I was already preparing to break off the engagement. However, I didn't want to just calmly break it off. I wanted to get some kind of revenge against her. I thought about it for about a week when she was visiting him instead of working and I came up with something. We were going to be hosting a Friendsgiving dinner at our house and I figured there was no better time to tell everybody about her affair than then. I almost considered not doing it then because I didn't want to ruin the mood, but toward the end of the meal, I stood up to make a toast. Everybody thought I was going to toast a friendship and my loving fiancé copyright, but I ended the engagement right there. My fiancé copyright was shocked when I made the announcement. I think she thought it was a joke at first, but it definitely wasn't. I elaborated by explaining that I knew she was going over to her ex-boyfriend's house. My fiancé copyright tried to defend it, but she couldn't come up with a good excuse. I just told her that the engagement was off and that she could go stay with Ben if she wanted to be with him so badly. After that, she ran off to the bedroom to go and hide away from everybody because she was humiliated. Everybody else packed their things and left shortly after. When they were all gone, she came back out and yelled at me for humiliating her in front of all of our friends. She told me that she was sleeping with him again, and that was all that it was. She tried to make it seem like because there was nothing emotional involved and wasn't an affair. I didn't believe that there weren't emotions involved. They were together for a long time and she stayed with him through a lot of stuff. She had to have had serious feelings for him to put up with as much as she did. I told her that I wanted her to get out of my house and I gave her a week to gather all of her things and leave. She did end up going back to Ben. I think they're still together, but he definitely hasn't changed his ways, so she must be miserable with him. All of the friends that were with us were definitely on my side. Some of them have tried to make excuses for her behavior by telling me that she might have been manipulated into getting back with him, but I still don't care what the reasoning behind it was. She cheated on me with a man who treated her like garbage, and I just couldn't be with a cheater. OP, it sounds like you were a caring partner who was there for your fiancé copyright. It sounds like she had a lot of trauma from the past relationship with Ben, and it is a shame that she couldn't find a way to move on from that so he wouldn't have any hold over her. I don't know if you had a chance to look through any messages or anything like that, but I would guess that he was probably in her ear and manipulating her. However, that doesn't excuse the fact that she lied and cheated on you. It's sad that she would leave somebody who cared about her so much and treated her so well to be with somebody who would take advantage of her the way that Ben was. I think she must have had a very low view of herself, which is not good for anyone. When you suggested that she should go to therapy or counseling, you were completely correct in that. It sounds like she should consider going. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed listening, please feel free to like and subscribe if you haven't already. Also, comment below with your thoughts